Hi, it's Roz, and I'm back for another bit of scallydandling about books. And today we're going to Guinea in West Africa. And that's because I've been reading this book, which is called The Radiance of the King by Camara Laye, who's from Guinea, or was from Guinea, and wrote this in 1954. Now, I think I have said that I like to get about a bit in my reading, and I do. And I actually have a long-term personal challenge running to read something from every country in the world. And I mean it when I say from every country rather than about. I'm aiming to find a book that is written by someone who grew up in each country, and that's about just seeing the world through different eyes, different sets of experience, different literary traditions. And I've been having a lot of fun with it over the last few years. I'm up to, I think this is my 149th country out of 195. So but as I go along, it gets harder to find a book in English translation or written in English from each place. So it may take me a few years yet before I get to 195. Now, Radiance of the King I was excited to read because it's been described as a classic of modernist West African literature. And the edition that I have is a New York Review of Books edition with an introduction by Toni Morrison. And obviously she's a bit of a heroine and a goddess to lots of us. And her introduction is really interesting and draws things out of this book that I couldn't attempt to, but I'll try to do it justice. So the author Camara Laye was born in 1928 when Guinea was the French colony of Upper Guinea, and grew up there. Then age 19 he got a scholarship to go and study engineering near Paris, which he did, and then he returned to Guinea when it was independent, lived and worked there for some years, and then I think was exiled to Senegal because of political differences. And he wrote a few books, not many, just a handful. And as I say, this one is being described as a modernist classic. And when you describe something like that sometimes you think, coming to read it, that it might turn out to be a bit worthy and a bit of a slog. And I'm really happy to say that this is a very enjoyable book to read. It's very good humoured, and I had a lot of fun reading it. So what is it that makes it worth reading is the question, I suppose. And the structure is modernist. Well, what does that mean? I don't know. I'm not a literary critic, but it's not a kind of standard literal narrative. It's more of a fable, I suppose, a bit like something like Pilgrim's Progress, in that there's a journey. Now, I said the journey word. I don't know about you, but if someone says to me that, oh, well, in this book the character really goes on a journey, that's a bit of a turn off for me. So I will hasten to add that there is a literal journey in this book, in that the main character Clarence, does travel, but it's kind of like a picaresque adventure, like, I don't know, Tom Jones or something. And yes, obviously he does learn through his experiences, although maybe not as much as we might have hoped he might. Learning is not one of his strong points, I have to say. What I like particularly is that we get no backstory about Clarence or any of the other characters. In fact, most of the characters have like a single name, or maybe they're just known by their occupation, like the beggar, the king, the innkeeper. Clarence, what we know about him is that he's in this unnamed country that we may presume is based on Guinea, because that's where Lay's from, but that's never said. So he's in this unnamed country. We don't really know how he's arrived there. We don't know anything about his past. All we know is that he's on his uppers. He's got into debt through gambling, and so he's kind of been rejected by the white community because he's a white man, and has to sort of fall in then into the world of the people, the indigenous people who live in this country. And he has all the ignorance of a white visitor, and is sort of unprepared, I guess, for his set of experiences. What is joyous about Clarence is that he is just a scrumptious example of an unreliable narrator. Now, I'm a bit of a fan of unreliable narrators, and if you are and you've got a favourite unreliable narrator or book with an unreliable narrator, do talk about it in the comments, because I think as a reader they can be tremendously enjoyable to read. For example, Clarence, we're never quite sure all the way through the book whether he's describing things accurately, or he's describing his understanding but he's misunderstanding, or is he kind of like willfully misunderstanding what's happening and choosing to get it wrong. And sometimes we have the pleasure as a reader of thinking, knowing when he's misunderstanding things, and we get to be cleverer than him. Oh, obviously, I must like that, mustn't I? So, for example, there's a point when he's in effect being sold, and he protests about being prodded like a chicken. But is oblivious to what's really happening. And, you know, whereas we're sitting there thinking, but it's obvious what's happening, can't you tell? Yeah, it's fun. I think describing it as a fable and might make it sound like you're a bit distant, but actually all the place is very vivid, the characters are very vivid, so there's a reality to the book. It's not just allegory, I suppose, is what I'd say. Now, but one of the problems with a kind of fable style of book, I think, is endings. Endings can be difficult. You know, do you have a fabulous ending to the book? And that's the weakest point in this book for me. I didn't like the ending. It didn't work for me. Having said that, I know that some people find it quite transcendent. Toni Morrison in the introduction describes it as like an epiphany and a moment of great beauty. So it may just be me. That's the structure, that's the style. What I liked about the book even more, though, was the way. Now, how to describe this? Laye, the author, has obviously absorbed the way that Africa, the whole continent of Africa, is often portrayed in Western literature, particularly historically, perhaps we hope not now, in a way that suggests that it is sort of mysterious, the dark continent, unknowable, dangerous or exotic or uncivilized, corrupting, all those things. If we think, for example, of The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, now that is a work of genius, but we have to acknowledge that the way that Africa, and that's kind of set in the Congo, but the way that's portrayed is quite limited. The way he uses that to progress his plot and so on, even though Conrad's intention was to be kind of criticise the colonialism and so on. So I would hesitate to describe it as a racist depiction. Nevertheless, it falls into certain cliches about Africa, and what Laye does is he grabs all those kind of cliches and tips them on their head, inverts them. Now, and that sounds a bit worthy and pious, but it's actually very good humoured, very funny, a very creative way of addressing all those sort of misconceptions and preconceptions. So particularly through the character of Clarence. So Clarence he falls in with these two boys called Nagoa and Noaga, and he can never get their names right and always muddles them up. Later in the book, he is living in a particular town, and he has one woman that he's officially living with, but actually a different woman comes and has and sleeps with him every night. You'll need to read the book to find out why. But he, the kind of almost like running joke is that he can't tell these women apart. Which is like the kind of and can he really not tell them apart, or does it just suit him to not be able to tell them apart? Is part of the unreliable narrator thing. one of the best moments in the book for this sort of turning things on their head, I suppose, is towards the beginning. Clarence is hoping to get a job with the king, which obviously he feels he should, because he's entitled, because he's a white man, so he must have something useful to offer. And he's speaking to another character, the beggar, who takes him under his wing, but also kind of exploits him in a way that's quite satisfying to us as a reader, I suppose. So he says to the beggar, "But I'd have taken any job, the humblest of jobs, with the king. I'd have been happy to just be a drummer boy." And the beggar says, "But drumming is a very skilled occupation, and there's like a noble caste that does drumming, you know." So yeah, moments like that are what make the book such a pleasure. Now, I would be thrilled if any of you out there have read this book, because I would love, no one else I know has read it, and I would love to hear your views and your experiences of it and your thoughts about it, because I'm sure there's a lot more to get out of it, you know, perhaps than I did, you know, as like a white English woman reading this book. Maybe, just maybe, if you haven't read it, you might be a tiny bit tempted from my review. If you've read things like Conrad or Graham Greene's book set in Africa, or Rider Haggard, or any number of like Western books set in Africa, then reading this one could be an interesting corrective, perhaps. So let me know if you do.